making the preservation of theosophical legacy, maintenance of tradition, and normal functioning extremely challenging. Unfolding in the secrecy of private apartments, Soviet theosophical currents were both cut off from their Western counterparts and experienced severely limited access to theosophical literature and other aligned teachings. Other two factors, in my opinion, prompted the shift of Russian theosophical groups from primarily text-based religio-philosophical formations with relatively clear-cut hierarchies, goals, and organizational structures to a primarily personality-based or charismatic model in which the keepers of the legacy soon became the channels for theosophical knowledge in a move that decidedly deviated from both the original theosophical teachings and from concurrently developing theosophical groups and communities abroad. So basically, you are your own channel and connection to God. You don't need Blavatsky or certain members of Theosophical Society to say that you can do it. If we were to apply the taxonomy proposed by Max Weber, Soviet theosophical groups fit the definition of a sect or a group that accepts only religious qualified persons and sets itself apart from the society it exists in, often finding itself in conflict with that society. In the case of Soviet Theosophists, this involuntary sectarian orientation persisted throughout the duration of the Soviet Union. An early example of the sectarian and charismatic model of theosophical knowledge transmission was the so-called White Sisterhood that I talked about in October, but the tendency only strengthened as the time went by, and many groups forming around someone who transmits, получает, передает the sacred knowledge to a small group of members aspiring to spiritual perfection. In the 90s, when the subterranean streams of occultic esoteric traditions could finally emerge from the private realms into the public sphere, preoccupations with the issues of lineage, transmission, and membership or leadership gained new urgency, especially for such groups as Theosophists. It is important to note that while during the 90s, the orientation of theosophical groups generally changed from strictly sectarian toward occultic stance, which means in Meredith McGuire's definition, they exhibit more tolerance and pluralism in their disposition toward other spiritual groups. The atmosphere of unprecedented openness and availability of the widest range of religious literature in translation and proliferation of new spiritual and religious groups and organizations. Some respondents in my interviews compared the flood of information in the 90s to the floodgates finally flying open, meant that there was an overlap in memberships in various groups of spiritual seekers, and many of them gathered around the newly established publishing houses or cultural centers like Ligatma, Sfera, Delfis, and others, which became hubs for all kinds of enlightening or proselytические activities. The publishing house Sfera especially gathered a team of like-minded people who described their experience working at it during the 90s as a dream job, where they worked side by side with like-minded people to spread the knowledge about various religious traditions without the need to adhere to specific religious dogma. Mushrooming spiritual and quasi-religious organizations in post-Soviet Russia faced similar internal and external challenges in terms of self-definition and legitimacy. But unlike many of them, theosophical groups did have a pre-revolutionary history. Keeping that in mind, let's outline several important initiatives spearheaded by the Russian Theosophists in the 90s. Okay. So first of all, was the creation of foundational histories to emphasize the continuity and preservation of theosophical lineage. Second, restoration of her revolutionary organization with all its formal attributes, so official registration, manifesto, journal, charter, and so on. Contacts with parental organization abroad, which is the headquarters in Atyar, participation in international events, and engagement in citizen diplomacy, like some other people during that time. Establishment of hubs of knowledge dissemination, most important publishing houses, cultural centers, благотворительные фонды, charitable or charity funds, and organization of exhibits, shows, public lectures, seminars, congresses, and other public events. So with that in mind, let's talk about theosophy and how it especially how it defined itself during that time. So the development of theosophical currents in post-Soviet space illustrates the tension between the desire for institutional recognition and international integration on the one hand, and the reality of an idiosyncratic development, namely the merging with Rurikism, that made that path quite challenging. According to the participants in the early stages of theosophical revival in the 90s, and I quote, first widely accessible and officially open event that marked the revival of theosophy in Russia was an exhibition dedicated to Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Sphinx of the 19th century, held in May 1990 in Moscow in the Central House of Writers, organized by Ekaterina Lebedeva and Dmitry Popov. The organizers explained that the exhibition was timed to coincide with the visit to Moscow at the invitation of the Association Peace Through Culture of the president of the International Theosophical Society, Radha Bernia. But now, this seemingly straightforward statement encapsulates the problem, the inherent complexity of Theosophical movement in Russia. Founded in 1989 by the poet and influential ecologist Valentin Sidorov, Peace Through Culture took the lead in restoring the Theosophical movement in Russia. So the revival of Theosophy, right from the start, was marked by deliberate or accidental blending of two lineages and their presentation as one teaching, a view that is certainly not held by the official Theosophical Society. Not then, not now. So just a glance at their website shows us that it has lots of different events, including courses that you can take through them. And here we can see this blending or mixing of ideologies as if they're all the same. They're all the same hierarchists, but not to not to all the theosophists. So it says that в данном разделе представлен курс лекций, прочитанных Алексеем Алферовым для слушателей научно-философского общества «Мир через культуру». Лекция подготовлена на основе трудов Блаватской, учеников, учения живой этики. So it's based on Blavatsky, the Ruriks, and then the works by the whole family of Ruriks and their disciples. And then the teachings of the Temple of the People, about which we'll talk about. So it encapsulates here basically everything that Russian theosophy is today. And so it kind of shows us how different it is from what's going on abroad. So moving on from here, from there, the drive for institutional recognition unfolded along two paths. Peace Through Culture enthusiasts officially registered the Russian Theosophical Society on January 8, 1991, and supplied the newly restored organization with all the formal elements, the charter, the manifesto, and the program. The group also chose to revive the pre-revolutionary journal Vestnik Theosophy, effectively claiming Theosophical legacy in Russia as their own. That same year, Andrei Gnezdilov, here's his picture, unfortunately he just passed away in May. He is a very famous Petersburg-based psychiatrist who used fairy tales in his therapy. So it's сказка терапия, among other really interesting modalities. That's why he's wearing this outfit. So fascinating person if you haven't read about him. But he was also a theosophist, or at least he claimed that he was a theosophist with deep family connections to the movement and a living legend. He represented Russia at the European Theosophical Congress for the first time since the 1920s, delivering a speech on the history of the movement in the Soviet Union. And he was part of that first organization that registered the Russian Theosophical Society. The efforts to establish official membership in the International Theosophical Society, undertaken in 1991 and 1992, proved to be futile. Lebedeva, one of the initial organizers of the movement, argues that the lack of transparency and unreasonable demands, including a request not to mention Agni Yoga in the Ruriks, and the expectation of the members' participation in expensive theosophical congresses, impeded the official recognition of Russian Theosophical Society in that year. During the 90s, during the mid-90s, and before that, I would just want to mention a couple of things. That the announcement about the recreation, reestablishment of Russian Theosophical Society appeared in Nauka и Religia, also interesting to if anybody wants to address that. And then Kurt Berg, the president of the European branch of International Theosophical Society, basically said that, well, we cannot give you memberships because you guys talk too much about work. But what can I wish for society? I just want to wish you inspiration. It's an interesting, a very nice wish, but it was lacking official recognition that Russians really wanted for years. So, well, we can talk about this later, but this is what happened in the beginning of the 90s. And then this is also another slide I wanted to show you that shows beautiful smiling faces of the members of the Theosophical Society that came to visit Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk back then. And they came together, but the picture doesn't show the whole picture, or the photo doesn't show the whole picture because there was much disagreement because Radka Bernier and Kulberg were the ones who kind of denied recognition or official registration of the Russian Theosophical Society. So Lebedeva and Popov were also there, as well as Karine Dilanyan, who was the director of this wonderful film, Who Are You, Madame Blavatsky, that came out in 1991, and has Irina Muravyova as the Blavatsky herself. So fascinating kind of series of events that started to make the teaching of theosophy more accessible. And actually, at the end of the film, you can see Radka visiting Blavatsky's home, I guess house where she was born in Dnipro. So going back to my text. But during the mid-90s, there was a series of crises and internal disagreements that impeded or that prompted creation of a confederation of lodges. So there was no single society because, partly because it was lacking recognition. And so the different lodges were kind of struggling for power. And it was decided that it will be a confederation of Theosophical lodges of the Russian Theosophical Society. So from Lebedeva's article on that, we read that it was a public, voluntary, self-governing organization. So the situation was critical on the one hand because of the lack of that official structure, but on the other hand, Theosophists still gathered and discussed and studied the important texts. So the lack of official recognition didn't really affect everyone the same way. As a side note, even today, there is no official Russian branch of Theosophical Society, even though you will see Russian Theosophical Society or Theosophical Общество России, Российское Theosophical Общество. So there are lots of different websites that will tell you that they are the Russian Theosophical Society. But we do have a representative of the president of the Theosophical Society, and that's Alexei Besputin, who heads one of the 7 lodges. But all of the 7 lodges are mentioned in the annual report by the official International Theosophical Society. So it's a complicated situation. So Peace Through Culture was not the only organization that tasked itself with the restoration of the Theosophical movement in Russia. I would like now to briefly turn to Delfis to demonstrate how this group developed initiatives I mentioned before and contributed to the dissemination of Blavatsky and Rorik's teachings. And here we'll finally get to talk about the temple of the people. The Eponymous Journal became the main outlet for the teachings and a vehicle for the establishment of their version of history of the movement. The center and journal were founded in the early 90s and published a variety of articles of Theosophy, Eastern philosophies generally, and the Roriks. In the early 2000s, Delfis published the memoirs of Elena Terarutunova, who is here in the center. So we have Guerrier, who is the pre-revolutionary Theosophist, linked through Terarutunova, or I guess to the newer generations of Theosophists. And she was also, Terarutunova believed that she was a disciple of Guerrier and then of Antarova. So all of these women are connected, and this lineage is explained or published in Delfis. So Terarutunova was a link between generations of the guardians of the teachings and played a central role in making the work of the older generation of Russian Theosophists available to the public, including Antarova's 2 lives in 1993. So careful reading of her first-hand accounts reveals several fascinating features of the Soviet Theosophical groups. The charismatic female leaders emotionally connected with their devoted disciples, who engage in long conversations in private apartments, exchange writings and visual artifacts, so the photos or pictorial representations of the teachers were kind of an important part of that transmission of lineage, in a general atmosphere of awe and devotion. Unfortunately, Terarutunova's memoirs are among very few publicly available documents chronicling the history of theosophical currents. And don't have time to go through all of the examples, and it's fascinating to read through her memoirs, but she talks about how the 2 lives by Antarova was как глоток святой живой воды, как будто я обрела второе дыхание мысли надежды, что я могу чего-то добиться, измениться к лучшему, помогать людям. With the attitude of utmost respect, if not awe, the young woman entered into the student-master relationship, receiving both the text, articles from Theosophical Messenger, and writings by Collins and Kamenskaya, and personal teachings. So she referred to Guerrier and Antarova as Великий друг учителя, and note the masculine gender that she uses. So that's another aspect that I would love to explore further, that it wasn't подруга or учительница, it was, well, different. Yeah. So, yeah. Or Gyrie herself was referred to by other Theosophists as Starец, the elder. So, and the letters were called святые реликвии, so sacred relics. So what we see here in Theosophica's memoirs is a departure from the canonical Theosophical teachers or the Mahatmas, and introduction of a more inclusive model for teacher. It can be a contemporary, it could be a friend, and even the death does not end the communication. It's just said that Gagina, another distinguished Theosophist, that Tera Arutyunova, even after the loss of her teacher, she still received instructions from, beyond, from her teacher in her dreams. Even though Delfis was a separate organization with its own circle of followers, a quick glance at the table of contents of the journal shows the same reliance on the classical teachings of Theosophy and on Agni Yoga as peace through culture. And I think I have another. Oh, yeah. So then another one. With one important difference. Delfis also engaged in citizen diplomacy, believing that the teachings that reached humanity through Blavatsky and the Rurists were also channeled by the founder of the Temple of the People, Francio Ladieu, in Halcyon, California, at the turn of the 20th century. The initial contact between Delfis and the temple happened around 1996, and in 1998, a group of Delphians visited the temple and stayed there for a month to learn more about the temple teachings and meet the members. In 2000, a group of Templars, as they are referred to by the Delphians, came to Moscow. And these are some of the pictures. So the first one is the Delphians visiting Halcyon, and then the Templars visiting Moscow. And I love the idea that when we talk about romanticism of that era, and I don't remember who exactly said it, but this kind of starry-eyed attitude, and we absolutely see that in the interactions with these two groups. I quote, and when on the second day as a meeting with Delfis team, and at the meeting with the Delfis team in the office, Linda Rollins, who is the guardian, who was given the authority to represent the chief guardian, Eleanor Shumway in Russia, uttered the words, the temple, which began with activities of Blavatsky, finally returns home. Many of us had tears in our eyes. We could hardly restrain our feelings. We caught every intonation of the spoken words. We received a high assessment of our work and understood that there was still much more work to be done. We needed to justify the trust. Then the Templars got acquainted with the members of the collective, told each other about their affairs, drank traditional tea, and took pictures for memory. So it's just a beautiful kind of snapshot of that era of excitement. Let's see, and the cultural and spiritual exchange continued well into the 2000s, but seemed to have lost its intensity in the last decade. These are just two examples of the so-called variety of theosophical experience in Russia during the 90s. Other centers of theosophical movement in Russia were such places as Kemerovo, with Vladimir Bakanov, who died in 2016, and his Resht, or Russian Esoteric School of Theosophy, named after Blavatsky. So he was one of the biggest organizers for Theosophy, and yet by several theosophical groups, he's believed to be a heretic because he created his own vision of Kala Chakra that was central to Blavatsky's teachings that is not really aligned with the Blavatsky teaching. Technically, I have to rely on others' knowledge about that. But that's a way to organize the space and the time and human fate, like all of it in a cyclical fashion. Well, some interesting things come out of this because according to his chart, the official representative of the Art Society in Russia is not quite aligned with Theosophical teaching. So it's used in a way to undermine a product. But that thing aside, in conclusion, I would like to just restate that Theosophy exerted an enormous influence on New Age groups worldwide and its concepts of ascended masters, spiritual hierarchies, postmortem states, and spiritual evolution. And I'm quoting Goodrick Clark, are commonplace ideas among contemporary beliefs, especially in contemporary new religious movements, end quote. After Theosophy split into different subgroups and branches, it produced multiple theosophical inspired movements like Alice Bailey, Arcane School, United Lodge of Theosophists, Rudolf Steiner and Theosophy, Rurikism, and many others. As we saw in Russia, the teachings of Theosophy became so closely linked with Rorik Agni Yoga that it became one of the main reasons precluding the acceptance of Russian theosophical groups into the International Theosophical Organization. By the 2000s, the aftermath of the financial crisis, infighting and condemnation of both Theosophy and Rory's Agni Yoga as anti-Christian teachings by leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, notably Kurai's book Satanism for Intelligentsia, signaled the end of the era of robust Theosophical revival in Russia, echoing worldwide process of integration of the Theosophical teachings into the wider context of globalized spiritual marketplace.